So far in our discussion of functions in Python, we've only talked about how the input can be different. So if we go by this example of there needs to be a function name, it has to have some code, and there could be some inputs and outputs, we made an adder function that wasn't taking any inputs, but it was able to return the sum of two numbers. So let's say we do 5 and 3. So return 5 plus 3, whatever that evaluates to. So I can also then define another function, let's say adder2, which again isn't taking any inputs, but what it's instead doing is it's asking the user for two numbers. Now, this function is considerably better than the previous one because the previous one only calculates the sum of 5 and 3. Here, we're actually going to be able to allow the user to provide what the numbers they want. And let's do return A plus B here. So in this case, if I were to make these boxes a version of these functions for adder, you're going to have no inputs, and you're going to have 5 plus 3 as the output, right? So let me rewrite that over here. So this is the output, so it's going to be 5 plus 3, always. In this case, it is a slightly better, so you don't have to hard code what the numbers you're summing up are going to be. Instead, there is still no input, but your output is going to be A plus B. There's going to be some code here and some code here. Now, this function, again, is considerably better because you're dynamically adding these values. You're dynamically asking the user for A and B and returning their sum. There is no use to have a function that just gives you the number 8. That sort of doesn't make sense. But in this scenario, this wouldn't work. Let's say I have this code here. I have this, this is my code file, and I have adder and adder2 defined. And let's say I do x equals 5 and y equals 10. There is currently no way of using either of those functions to find the sum of x and y, because none of those functions are actually taking any inputs here. So that is a problem, because although adder2 allows us to ask the user for inputs to sum them up, but what if we already had two variables defined beforehand? We don't really need the user input in this, and we wanted to sum those up. So in that case, we're going to go ahead and add a new definition of an adder function. So I'm going to erase this for now. We'll bring them back in. But let's say in a new code file, start from the beginning, let's say we define adder3 here. And I'm going to leave some gap here. And I'm going to be no longer asking the user for input, but instead I'm going to be using these parameters or arguments to get a result out. So if I were to make the box for this function before I actually write the code for it, I'm hoping what it does is that it takes two numbers as inputs and returns their sum as output. So this is adder3 here, and it's going to do some code in here. And what I'm hoping is that it takes n1 and n2 as inputs, so parameters or arguments. So I'm going to call them as parameters, but we know that it basically means inputs. And as the output, I want to return, not print. Printing doesn't really mean giving you an output. Printing just means printing to the terminal. I want to give an output which is n1 plus n2. Okay, that's pretty much doable. What I will do is I'll do n1 comma n2. So I'm going to pass all of my parameters that I want in a comma separated in these parentheses, and I'll just do return n1 plus n2. And that's it. That's all you need. So if I were to, let's say, do x equals 10 and then y equals 20, and then in line 5 I do z equals adder3, So I will go back to the definition of how I defined this function here. This function, what I'm hoping, is going to take two integer numbers and it's going to sum them up and return the sum to you. So z should be the sum of any two numbers I provide here. So let's try with the numbers 6 and 7. And let's look at what's going to happen in the terminal here. So let me put a space and, whoa, too dark. Let's just do white then. Okay, and inside the terminal, at line 1, when it's executed, it's going to acknowledge there exists a function adder3 and that it takes two parameters. So I'm going to start calling this whole function as the function takes two parameters n1, n2, and returns their sum. I'm going to add a new line of code. I'm going to print the value of z2 at the end to show you what's going on. Okay, so at line 1, it will acknowledge that there exists a function that takes two parameters n1, n2, and returns their sum. Right now, when you define these functions, you do not have to worry about the values of n1 and n2. Those are going to be provided when you actually call the function. So make your function as if n1 and n2 already had some values and you're playing around with them. At line 3, it will acknowledge that you have defined variables y equals 10 and x equals 10 and y equals 20. At line 5, you are saying z is equals to adder3 with the parameters, with the arguments 6 and 7. So if I use n1 and n2, I'm going to call them parameters, and when I'm passing in the values, so when I'm, a good term to know, when I'm passing the values to the function, I'm going to use arguments. I could use them interchangeably, but I'm going to try to stick to these. So this function has defined two parameters and it returns their sum, and I'm passing 6 and 7 as arguments to this function. So what I'm doing, technically, is that once this line is executed, we know that this will evaluate to something. So Python will jump to the definition of that function. And what happens to 6 and 7 is positional. So 6 is in the first place, and 1 is defined first, 7 is in the second place, and 2 is defined second. So Python will say that n1 gets the value 6, n2, because of the position, gets the value 7, and inside the definition now, this will be 6, that will be 7, and you're seeing return 6 plus 7 here, which is going to be 13. So when this function stops executing, it'll bring back the value 13 with it. And so this whole function, after its execution with 6 and 7 as arguments, is going to evaluate to 13. Z becomes 13, and you're going to print 13 as the output. Now let's try a different example. So let me erase all of this. Okay, so instead of hard-coded x, 6, and 7, I'm going to now use the values of y and x and y. So I'm going to pass x, comma y here. Okay, so at line 1, when a program executes, this does not change. So this function adder3 still takes two parameters n1, n2, and returns their sum. Then at line 3 and 4, it is defining two variables x and y with the values 10 and 20. And then at line 5, it is calling the adder function with x and y as arguments. So again, what this means is that I'm going to evaluate the right-hand side first. So I'm going to evaluate what this function becomes. And what happens here is that n1 will get the value of x, n2 will get the value of y here. So if x was 10, n1 becomes 10. N2, because it is being the position, is the same for y. It's going to get the value of 20. And you're basically printing or returning, sorry, not printing, returning the value of 10 plus 20, which is 30. So return 10 plus 20. And so I'm calling this function with these arguments. It evaluates it to be 30. I'm going to get something back, and that's going to be the number 30 because it's returned back to me. And this whole thing evaluates to 30. Z becomes 30, and the output of the program is going to be 30. Let's look at the implementation of our functions in Atom. And so I'm going to define first by defining adder that doesn't really take any inputs. Instead, it asks the user for inputs. And we're going to say enter A, and B is going to be the same thing, int input enter B. And let's do return A plus B. And let's define variables x equals 10 and y equals 20. And we can do z equals adder and print z, right? And if I were to run this code, it'll say enter A to be 10, B to be 20, and then it prints 30 because at line 10 it went back and did all of that. So what would happen if I tried to pass in x and y here right now? So what I'm trying to do is I'm saying, can I pass x and y as arguments to this function, knowing that it doesn't really have any inputs or arguments defined. So let's just see what happens. Well, what's going to happen is Python is going to go through and come at this point. So it will acknowledge there exists a function called adder. It doesn't take any inputs, and it's going to do a lot of stuff. It will then define the variables x equals 10, y equals 20, and then at line 10, as it's about to go back and execute these lines of code, it realizes that I'm passing arguments that don't really exist in the definition. So you'll get the particular error that says the adder function takes 0 positional arguments, but 2 were given. So this number has to match the number of variables or parameters you have defined. So if, let's say, I had defined a parameter, 3 parameters here, and I was only passing, let's say, 2, then that's going to give you an error. There is a way to define defaults, but we're not looking at those right now. So in this case, what you have to do, starting beginning test, is that you have to ensure that the number of arguments you're passing is equal to the number of parameters you defined in your function definition. So again, this time around, it's going to work, right? So 10 and 20. But now let's modify adder to not ask the user for inputs, but instead use arguments or parameters. So I'm going to just use A and B here. And again, the idea here is that these variables don't currently have any value defined. It is when you're calling the function, you're going to pass on those values. So let's see what the mismatch is going to give us an error again. So I have 2 variables, 2 parameters defined, but I'm not passing any arguments here. So it should give us an error, and you get an error. So adder is now missing 2 arguments, A and B, and I have given it none. Okay, so let's try with the values 1 and 2. So now what's going to happen is that there were 2 inputs required, and I'm passing it 2 inputs. So A will become the value 1, B will get the value of 2, and it's going to return 1 plus 2, which is 3. So our program should print 3 here. And it does. I can also modify it to, instead of 1, make it 10, even let's say x. And so in this case, it should give us 12. Because at line 8, this whole thing, when it's executed, is going to say, okay, take the variable A and pass along the value of x to it, which is 10. So A becomes 10, B becomes 2, and then you're basically returning the sum of 10 and 2. So, Another thing to note is that I cannot use the variable names that I've used to define my function down here and hope that they work. So right now I am very much able to do, let's say, something like this. So I'm going to redefine these as A and B. This will work. But what is happening is that these A, B's, this set is very much different from this set. We will talk about scope in the next video, but for the time being, what you need to know is that if this were the case, and this were the case, and let's say I do z equals a plus b and return z back. So this function, adder, takes two parameters and it will find their sum and it's going to return their values. So in this case, let's just do adder and print z here. So this is one of the things you might consider doing. So let me actually fix this. This is one code you might think about actually writing, where in case you're thinking that, you know, when I'm returning the value of z, I'm sure that z exists down there after I've called this function. But that's not quite going to be the case here. So it is going to say, Python is going to say that z does not exist. So it went through and ran a pass of the whole thing, and it said that this variable z is not defined. But you could say, hey, I defined it at line 2. Well, it is defined within a scope of this function. So think of this function having its own tiny little world where the variable z exists. Outside of it, it does not. So in this case, this wouldn't do. So make sure that for now, before I put out the next video on scope, for now, make sure that you're not reusing these variables that you've defined within the scope outside of those functions. Okay, so let's test out a couple of, let's test out different kinds of functions that we can make. So let's say I say, write a function that checks if the given input is even or odd. All right, so let's define, let's call it checker, right? If the given input is even or odd. If I say that, that means that I'm asking you for a parameter. So let's call it number, right? And in my definition, I want to check if that given input, which is number now, is even or odd, okay? I will say that if number person assigned 2 is equals to 0, and it says that checks, so this is muddy, I think. I don't know if I should return true or false or I should print true and false. So what I'll do is I'll just return it for the time being. So if that number, remainder 2 is 0, which means it's even, I'm going to return, let's say we return a string called even. Otherwise, we return a string called odd. So in this case, I have two return statements. But given the value of number, only one of them is going to be evaluated at a time. If the number is even, you're going to call this line. If the number is odd, you're going to run this line. But make sure that return is still going to be happening. So you don't want anything like this. You don't want to return when it is even, otherwise you just do print whatever, right? Don't do that. Always have a way, if you're using while loops inside your functions or for loops or if statements, always ensure that there is a return value if your function is meant to return something. Okay, so now what we'll do is we're going to run this function. Let's say let's make it quicker. Let's do print checker and let's pass the number 3 into it. So when this function executes, this program executes at line 3, it will acknowledge that I have a function called checker that takes a parameter called number. And what I'm doing is I'm checking if that number is even or odd, and based on that, I'm returning a string. So when the program comes to line 10 here, it is going to take the value of 3 and assign it to the variable number once it goes back and executes this whole thing. So you should be getting odd printed out, and you do. And let's try it again. Let's do it with a number 4, and this time around it should do even. Awesome. And again, what happens if I don't pass any arguments? It's going to give me an error. It's going to say that you're missing one argument here. You should have passed one argument for this number that you have defined. Now, what happens if I give it something that is definitely not a number? In this case, you're going to get an error. So in this case, what was happening is I was really hoping that whatever the value of number is, that it is in fact a integer. And I have passed along a string, so this argument or sort of breaks. I can't find the remainder divided by 2 of a string, so this breaks out. So when I say that your function needs to do a specific task, so the function needs to do a specific task, I also want you to make sure that the arguments are defined as the types you want them to be. So in this case, this function was checking the user was checking a number and seeing if it was even or odd. In that case, your function right now doesn't really need to worry about, oh, what if the number value is actually going to be a string? Or what if I pass, let's say, a float to it? 13.4, right? In this case, I think this should work. Yeah, it'll give you an odd number, because what it does, it'll convert that into a string or an integer. So when you're defining a function, make sure that it performs one specific job. And also don't worry too much really for now about the type of your variable. When I was defining this function, I didn't really care what the value of number could be. I was going along with the notion that if it is integer, this is what the code should be. Okay. Let's try another example. And let's say we have to write a function that, so let's write a function that returns if a number is 0, positive, or negative. And then I'll add a stipulation. I'll say if the number, okay, let's say parameter. If the parameter is not a number, then return nothing. So I've added a few more things here. So let's see what's going to happen. So I'm going to start by defining a function, and let's just call it number checker, right? So number checker. And it is going to take a single parameter, right? So I've said write a function that returns if a parameter is 0, positive, or negative. So I'm going to call it n. Let's make things easier. And inside, I should first check if that is a number or not. So if they do pass me a number, then I need to be okay with it. So let's just say that this function, see, now I have to modify what the function is like. So I'm going to say this n is always a string. Okay. So then I can do if n dot is digit is equal to true, then I'm going to return if it's 0, positive, or negative. Otherwise, then I can return false. Now, you'll notice that I didn't specify in my question that n needs to be a string or integer. So based on the solution, I have to make a few changes. If you are given a number, one other way of testing if it's a number is you can just check the type. So you can do type of n is equals to int. That might give you if it's integer or not, but I'm going to go with this example here instead, where I'm going to say that the parameter n is always going to be a string, and if there is a number filled in it, so if it's just made of numbers, then I'm going to go ahead and do this stuff. Otherwise, I'm not going to. And so let's do if n is digit is true. I'm going to check that if n is less than 0, I'm going to return negative. Elif n is greater than 0, I'm going to return positive, and we know that the last case should always be will always become 0, right? Okay, and so for the else for this guy, if in fact it wasn't true, I'm gonna print something. I'm gonna say not a number, so nan, and then I'm going to return I'm actually going to return nothing here, so I'm just going to leave it off like this. Okay, so I have now defined a function. It's called number checker. It is taking a single parameter n, which I'm hoping is always going to be a string. And then I'm saying that if n is made up of integers, then I'm going to check, and I need to also do one thing, n is equals to int of n. I'm going to convert it into an integer, and then I'm going to check all of these values. If that is not the case, that n isn't made of integers, then I'm going to print not a number. And note that I'm not returning anything in that case, because it says that return nothing if it's not a number. So if I were to run this now, let's define, let's say, let's do z is equals to number checker, and let's pass the number 5, and let's print the value of z here. Okay, int has no object is digit. I remember it needs to be a string going in. Okay, so it says it's positive. So what happened was at line 16, it's going to evaluate the right hand side first, which means taking the value string 5 and passing it to this variable n. And then you're saying, okay, n is a string, so I can run the isDigit method on top of it. And it's going to return true. And then it is going to then convert it into an integer and then check these things. Based on what the value of n was, in our case it's 5, it's going to return negative, positive, or 0. Cool. Now let's say we replace it with ABC here. And let's run this code. Okay, so with ABC, n is getting the value of string ABC, and this thing is going to be false because n is currently not made up of digits. So it's going to jump all the way to the else block, and then it's going to print nan, not a number, and that's what you get printed. Now, after this line, I am currently at the very end of my function definition. This is not a loop that I would go back to the top and check something. Instead, I'm at the very end of my loop of my function. If I'm at the very end of my function and I haven't returned anything, well, it's going to return nothing basically. And so you get z to be none printed out. You should now be able to have custom functions that have both inputs and outputs. And in class, what we're going to do is we're going to take our grading assignment from, I think, assignment 3, and we're going to convert it all into functions, small little functions, to see how modular that code can become.